host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking about college and university finances. Dr. Bronté Jones is treasurer of St. John's College in Annapolis. She helps lead the college's long-term financial and management planning, including the business office, IT and print shop operations, and building and grounds on campus. Dr. Jones earned her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome.
Good morning.
Well, good morning. Dr. Jones, if you wouldn't mind saying a word or two about what does a treasurer do at a college?
It's funny you should ask. I think I told you, I recently did a presentation on what it means to have a chief business officer on campus. My short answer is everything that's not fundraising and teaching. But I work with the business office, personnel office, information technology, facilities, meaning the cleaning, the maintenance of the buildings and grounds, and also new construction projects. So it's a pretty full portfolio.
So but you said you don't do fundraising and you don't do teaching.
I don't do fundraising and I don't do teaching at St. John's.
At St. John's. But how do you know how much money you have to work with then?
Well, we're primarily a tuition-driven institution. So I'm looking at the number of students that we have, monitoring our endowment performance, and then looking at what our fundraising activities are. I work very closely with our vice president for fundraising.
Fair enough. Well, in terms of tuition, so how does that work exactly? You'll say, will you determine what the tuition will be next year?
That's a pretty lengthy conversation. We actually track ourselves against a very elite group of national liberal arts institutions. So there are, let's say, 30 of such institutions. We monitor what happens with their tuition. We'd like to be, let's say, in the top 10, but not in the top 5. So we monitor what's happening with Wellesley or Swarthmore or Kenyon or Reed. And so we'll look at how much they increase their tuition, speculate about how much we think they're going to increase it in the subsequent year, and then make a calculated decision based on that.
So if they were going to increase the tuition, let's say 6%, you might say, well, we'll go ahead and raise it 5%?
We might do that because, again, we want to be in the top 10, but we don't want to be in the top 5 because we don't like the message that might send to our prospective students. But
then wouldn't that mean that in all likelihood then that every year that a student is at St. John's, the tuition would go up?
Yes, but that's an expectation. I think that all families come into higher education understanding.
So then what's interesting, what I just heard you say, if I didn't misunderstand that, is that there's really very little external pressure to not raise tuition.
Well, I wouldn't say that because the current economic environment has led us to a place where families need much more financial aid. And so for private institutions, we call that the discount rate, the amount of grants we're giving to our students. And the discount rates have been growing drastically given the current economic environment. So we are more sensitive to tuition increases now than we've been in the last 20 years.
Fair enough. So I mean, but you could look at that in two ways. You could either increase the amount of financial aid you give to students across the board,
yes,
or you could do bigger packages for certain students.
That's correct. And in our case, we're a full need institution and we're need blind, meaning if Steve and Bronté are both applying, I don't look at what aid package Steve needs versus Bronté. I admit them both, and then I provide whatever financial aid the two students will need to attend our institution. And again, in this economic environment, our students tend to be a little needier, so my financial aid budget has actually gone through the roof.
Fair enough. And speaking of roofs, I'm interested in how one decides when to fix up a building, how you decide to spend money on a new facility of some sort. Can you walk us through how that happens?
Certainly. Typically, your chief fiscal officer is involved in the campus planning, the campus master planning process. We just did such a thing at St. John's in 2009 where I did a buildings conditions assessment looking at all of my existing buildings and also a space utilization study where I looked at what my needs were. I then sit down with the other officers to prioritize which buildings should be fixed first or which buildings should be built next. And then really based on our fundraising activities, that often dictates, unless a roof starts to leak, that often dictates the order in which we'll complete those projects.
Fair enough. And so, but these are massive projects then.
They're very massive projects.
So how will you finance a new building like that?
Well, in some cases we do fundraising. We recently built 2 new dorms and we had very generous fundraising efforts there where we got total funding for those projects. I'm about to build a new building on campus now. Some will come from fundraising, and the state of Maryland will actually fund a portion of that through a capital grants project that the state has.
And why would the state of Maryland finance a capital project like that at a private college?
Well, for two reasons. Because we serve a certain population of Maryland students, and then secondly, because of the reputation of St. John's, we attract a large number of students to the state. And so it's incumbent upon the state to make sure that all of its institutions are stellar so that we can continue to attract quality students to the state.
Fair enough. And in terms of, I think that not everybody who's watching this knows that much about St. John's. If you could say a word or two about the campus here in Maryland, well, close to here. We're in the District of Columbia, but relatively close to Maryland, and the one in New Mexico. Certainly.
St. John's College is a great books institution. We have campuses in Annapolis, Maryland, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's an all-required curriculum, meaning students major in liberal studies. There is only one major. They must take all of the courses that are a part of our program, which includes 4 years of seminar, 4 years of language, 4 years of mathematics, 3 years of science, and 2 years of music. So it's a very rigorous curriculum, but we're a very small institution with 500 students on both of our campuses.
Fair enough. And for those 500 students, would you mind saying what your budget is per year?
The budget in Annapolis is $32 million and roughly $30 million for our Santa Fe campus.
And does that mean that you need to raise $30 or $32 million each year in order to meet that budget?
It means through fundraising, tuition and fees, and in our endowment income, I bring in about $32 million worth of revenue to cover our expenses.
And how does the endowment work in terms of the revenue from the endowment?
Most institutions, all institutions, have a spending formula. Our spending formula allows me to spend somewhere between 4.5% and 5.5% of our earnings on an annual basis. So we have a smoothing formula that actually dictates for me how much of the endowment earnings I can spend per year. And roughly, we spend about 5.5% of our earnings.
Now, why 5.5? Why not 6? Why not 3? Where did that 4.5 to 5.5 number come from?
Well, it's about responsibility. The purpose of the endowment is to sustain the institution into eternity, if you will. And so you don't want to raid the earnings because you want them to be there for future years. But you do want to take advantage of some of the earnings for current operations, especially in our case where the largest portion of our endowment is for financial aid, for the grants that I need to provide for my students to attend.
Well, my understanding is that there are a number of nonprofits that have to spend a certain amount of money per year in terms of money from the endowment.
Yes, most institutions have an investment policy. In my case, my investment policy allows me to spend between 4.5% and 5.5% based on a smoothing formula.
But do other institutions that are not educational institutions, my understanding is that a number of institutions have a requirement of 10%.
10% is actually relatively high. According to the prudent rule, 7% it should be the max of the earnings that you might take per year. But that would really be dictated by the board of that particular nonprofit.
And speaking of the board, what's your relationship with the board?
It's funny you ask. I'm just coming back from our winter board meeting in Santa Fe. I act as the liaison with the audit committee, the buildings and grounds committee, the investment committee, the finance committee, and the compensation committee. So anything that has to do with the operational matters of the college, I interface with those committees.
Well, fair enough. And in terms of compensation, so let's assume somebody, a professor would like a raise. Do they come to you and say, I'd like a raise?
I wish. At St. John's, we actually have a very intricate salary system where there's a base salary for all faculty members, and then there's an increment for every year of service on campus. So every member of our faculty, depending on the years of service, can calculate their colleague's salary based on the base salary.
Well, what would a new faculty member who just started make at St. John's?
Roughly $70,000.
And do they have a housing allowance as well, or that's the salary?
That's the salary. But we have a very generous benefits package, which attracts a very solid group of new faculty members.
So it's interesting. So you've got the pressure on one hand of not raising the tuition because students obviously are saving a lot of money, and parents are taking out a lot of loans to send their kids to schools like St. John's.
Yes.
You also have the pressure of faculty members who need the money to support their families, and you probably have competition from other colleges that if you were going to pay considerably less, then faculty members might go to other colleges.
Yes, but again, because we have a very attractive benefits package, that same group of institutions who we track ourselves with in terms of tuition, we track ourselves against in terms of salary, and we actually measure up quite well against our competitors.
Well, what would be some of the benefits that a faculty member would get at St. John's?
The tuition benefit is very attractive. If your student attends St. John's, we'll pay their full tuition to attend St. John's, but if they were to go elsewhere, we'll pay 50% of that. Well, if you take into consideration my tuition is $46,000, 50% of that is $23,000 towards your child attending another institution. That's very generous. Very generous retirement package, health insurance benefits that are unheard of in this time. So again, once you put all of those together, it's a very attractive package to attend the college.
Fair enough. And in terms of how many faculty members are there at St. John's?
There are roughly 90 on the Annapolis campus, and I'd say 80 on the Santa Fe campus.
And can professors go back and forth between the two campuses?
That's the beauty of having a program such as ours where it's all required. All of our faculty members have to learn to teach across the curriculum. So you don't solely teach mathematics or science. You teach across the curriculum. So both our faculty and students transfer between the two campuses.
Fair enough. If I can walk you through a question in terms of donations.
Certainly.
Let's assume I went to St. John's College, I had a good experience, and I want to donate $1,000 to St. John's. Who do I give it to? What happens with that $1,000?
Well, you'd give it to the advancement office, and it would depend on whether you restricted that gift or you gave it to us as an unrestricted gift. We prefer unrestricted gifts. And if that were the case, that would go into our annual fund and go towards our operating budget. Again, given our focus on providing scholarship opportunities or grant opportunities to our students, it is a fair bet that your donation would go to fund a student's scholarship to St. John's College.
And what percentage of the budget then is for scholarships?
Oh, I'd easily say 30% of our budget goes towards financial aid.
So 70% goes for things other than financial aid?
Yes.
And what percent, so if 30% is going for financial aid, what percentage goes for faculty salaries?
Well, I'd look at salaries comprehensively. So for faculty and staff, I'd say roughly 48%.
So half the budget, more or less, is going for salaries and benefits?
Yes, and that's very common in higher education.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, that's very high, I would think.
Yes, that's why when you're in an economic environment such as this, it gets very difficult to make cuts to your budget that ultimately do not impact people.
But then how could a university ever really cut their expenses?
Well, you have other things. I would say you've got travel and entertainment, you've got supplies. There are other places that you can cut. And when you're making cuts, you think about what are the sacred cows on your campus. Financial aid is that thing on our campus. So that's the very last thing I would cut when I'm looking for opportunities to balance the budget.
But couldn't you balance the budget then by basically asking one faculty member to not return?
We could do that, but we have a very strong sense of community at St. John's College. So that would be pretty low on my list of options to exercise. Last year, for example, when we were looking at the increase in our financial aid, it was interesting to see that we were having conversations about potential adjustments to faculty salaries, and our senior faculty were willing to take cuts so that the junior faculty would be less impacted. That's the sense of community that we have at St. John's.
And that in fact happened?
Actually, we did not, and we've not had to cut any salaries or make any salary adjustments over the last 3 years.
But let's say I'm a faculty member at St. John's,
Yes.
and I come to you, Bronté, and I say, I know you're the person who's in charge of all the money, and I have an offer to increase my salary considerably at the University of Texas, let's say, where you used to be.
Yeah.
And what would you say?
I would be having a conversation with the dean on our campus, who's equivalent to the provost, to look at ways that we might encourage that particular faculty member to stay on campus. We would not make an adjustment to an individual's salary, but we would look at other ways that we might encourage that faculty member to stay on campus.
Could you give an example or two about what would be an example?
We might give release time. There might be a specific area that you have an interest in. So you would like to teach one or two less courses so that you can learn more about Beethoven, or you'd like to know more about the Bronté sisters. So there are a number of areas. You might want to help us rewrite our calculus manual. So we might look at other ways or other opportunities to maintain your attention and interest in the college.
Would you ever give a housing allowance?
Actually, we have a faculty home loan program at the college that's very attractive, where we offer our faculty members up to $150,000 towards the purchase of their first home in Annapolis or in Santa Fe. So that's another one of those benefits that make the college a pretty attractive place to work.
Fair enough. Could you say a word or two about where St. John's students go after they leave St. John's?
Oh, certainly. Our students go on to spend a considerable amount of time in education, whether that's K through 12 or higher education. And as you might suspect, we have doctors, lawyers, not quite Indian chiefs, but quite a large number of entrepreneurs. They're free thinkers, so we're always interested to see where they go.
Fair enough. In terms of the departments, I know St. John's doesn't have departments like traditional colleges.
Yes.
But I know you've worked at other universities and at Texas, which we talked about a second ago, and I know you got your PhD there. Let's say you had the same job you have at St. John's, but at Texas.
Yes.
I assume that's a bigger budget, a massively bigger budget.
Yes.
In that instance, would one department essentially be competing against another department for financial resources?
Well, at the University of Texas, it's a very decentralized budget process, meaning each school has its own budget. So there really isn't the competition. In the state of Texas, there's a lot of formula-based budgeting. So it's based on the number of students that are in a chair. It's based on the program of instruction. So each institution within the university has to meet a number of standards in order to get funding.
So then the number of students who take a certain course for certain big universities then matters a lot.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. Again, at a number of the large institutions, it's formula-based. So it's the number of credit hours, it's the number of bodies that are sitting in a chair. And at an institution the size of the University of Texas with 50,000 students, that's how the state of Texas appropriates their funds.
And you must be friends with many CFOs from
Yes.
around the country. And I assume this is a topic of discussion that you guys have.
Almost definitely.
Do other universities say, well, I don't really feel like financing the philosophy department with the economics department?
Again, it goes back to understanding what are the core drivers for a particular institution. Obviously, on many campuses, there are some programs that are more attractive or more popular than others. But that goes back to the management of the institution and where you place your priorities. So that could be different at a number of institutions.
But then the CFO would need to be sensitive to what those priorities are in order to be effective on that particular campus.
Exactly. I mean, the CFO is a critical player with the other vice presidents or officers on any campus. It's critical to be a part of the conversations because in my case, I often say, I never want the business decisions to trump the academic decisions, but my role is to discuss the business implications of any decisions that we might make. But we are, after all, an institution of higher education. That is what we are there to provide, that service.
But what about and that's a fair point, but what about faculty members who say to you, well, Bronté, I really like what you do and you're a nice person, but you know, we're an institution of higher learning. What's all this business stuff about?
Again, that goes back to the presentation that I made a few weeks ago with some of our donors. It's very important that I'm concerned about keeping the lights on and the heat on. It is very important that the cleaning staff is there to clean up the labs or to have the trash removed from the classrooms, or that the dining hall is running appropriately so that the students can be focused when they're in the classroom. In this age of technology, it's important that the internet is working or that Wi-Fi connections are up and functional. So I think I spend a fair amount of time talking to my colleagues about the operational needs of the campus and why those cannot be disrupted, because they will challenge the academic program. So it's an interrelationship. And I think my colleagues appreciate the operational needs of our institution.
What about your students? Do you ever interact with students who say, well, it would be really neat if we had such and such thing on campus?
Yes, I have very active relationships with the students on campus. Our student polity, which would be the Student Government Association, and providing their funding, and talking about the needs of the institutions and ways in which we can be helpful to them, but conversely, ways in which the students can be helpful to the overall mission of the college. So I'm actively engaged with the students.
So what are some things that students tend to ask you for?
Students, we talk a lot about becoming a completely wireless campus, which is a slight challenge for us at St. John's because computers are not allowed into the classroom at St. John's. And so technology from that standpoint has not been a priority. But as we have more and more faculty members bringing tablets and notebooks to campus, we have done a comprehensive study of what it will mean to make the campus wireless. So I would say that's the greatest concern of the students, and constantly increasing the bandwidth so that they can stream their music and their videos. Being responsive to their technology needs is, I would say, at the top of their list.
And you also mentioned that you had things that you were asking them. What are the things that you tend to be asking students?
One of the things I asked the students for, which got me into the student newspaper, was an audit of the funds that we provide to the student organizations. We give the student organizations a considerable amount of money each semester, and so we made a deal that before I give you your next disbursement, you have to turn in receipts to show me how you spent the first disbursement. And that's actually been a very interesting process, but the students have come to appreciate that these are college resources, and I have to be sure that they are accounted for appropriately and in compliance with our institutional rules. Wasn't popular when I first instituted it, but they understand the need for it.
So students were coming to you asking for money and didn't expect that they would need to turn in any receipts?
Well, I actually write a check to the president of the Student Government Association, and then basically it was in their hands, and there was no further accountability with the business office. But under my reign, let's just say, I don't disperse funds to any entity on campus without the expectation of receipts. And so we implemented that about 4 years ago, and they've learned to happily live with it.
And I'm going to guess that the Board of Trustees, when they watch the show, is going to be very happy about that answer.
I'm sure they will.
Fair enough. In terms of the board, how much turnover is there on the St. John's board?
We have a very large board, and they rotate every 3 years. They can serve 2 consecutive terms, but I would say the vast majority of the board members have been on the board in some form or fashion in my six-year tenure at the institution. And particularly with the committees I work with, investment and finance, you don't want a lot of turnover. You want the continuity so they understand the rhythm and the patterns that have existed with both the endowment and our budgets.
And in terms of the endowment, who is managing the endowment?
We have a very active investment committee of our Board of Visitors and Governors. We meet quarterly, but we actually have the bulk portion of our endowment invested with TIF, the Investment Fund for Foundations. They provide monthly reports, and again, those go out to the members of the committee, and I'm actively engaged with them in terms of our asset allocation and our returns.
And do students ever speak to you about that asset allocation?
Yes. I would say I'm interviewed by the student newspaper once or twice a year. They like to know about the budget. They like to know about the endowment performance. They also like to know about buildings and grounds. What are the latest projects? What are we renovating? What are we going to build? I have a very open door policy, so any question that they have, I'll entertain.
And how do you interact with the other CFOs in the state and around the country?
I'm very active with NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. There's a Small Institutions Council. I was on that body. So we are engaged through email contact, through regional conferences, the national convention, on a regular basis, where we're asking one another about discount rates, about audit firms, about construction firms. It's a very active dialogue because we're all facing the same challenges in this economic environment.
And do you ever interact with universities in other countries?
Actually, I do. I'm a commissioner on the Middle States Commission of Higher Education, so I actually do accreditation visits for all institutions that are within our region. Last year I had the great pleasure of being at the University of Puerto Rico, which was a very hard assignment.
In the winter, I assume.
It was a very hard assignment to drive around the country and assess the financial resources of the university. But I do get out of the country to assist in that manner.
I thought Puerto Rico was part of the United States.
It is, but there are a number of other campuses that are affiliated with the American University, with a number of institutions that have campuses in Chile, for example, and other regions of the country.
And in terms of study abroad, if a student, not necessarily at any particular campus, if a student wants to study abroad, how are those dollars made sure that those are spent properly?
Well, at St. John's, we do not have a study abroad program.
Which I knew, but I thought that Texas has a very active one.
Texas does have a very active study abroad program. Again, those are treated as restricted funds, and they can only be used for the students to attend certain institutions, and there are compliance officers within the institution to make sure those funds have been appropriated properly.
Fair enough. We only have 1 minute left.
Yes.
What bit of advice would you have for somebody who is thinking about hopefully having a job like yours someday?
I would say more important than having strong accounting and financial acumen, my communication skills in this current economic environment have been absolutely paramount to my role at St. John's College and within the higher education community.
Well, you are a very clear communicator, and I've enjoyed chatting with you, so thank you for coming on the show.
Been my pleasure.
If you would like additional information about Dr. Bronté Jones or St. John's College, please visit sjca.edu. If you have comments or suggestions about Higher Education Today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.